Hello, and welcome to another episode of Worst to Best. Today, I will be ranking the studio albums of King Crimson. You can't have a conversation about progressive rock and not talk about these guys. Some argue that they invented the prog rock genre with their debut album. We'll discuss that a little later on. Let me be clear before I start, I do not hate any of their albums. There are just some that I prefer over others. Every album of theirs has great moments. I respect them because they're a band that never went pop like some of their peers did. They have truly stayed progressive for their entire career. Some quick notes before beginning. I have only ranked King Crimson's 13 studio albums. This list does not include EPs, live albums, compilations, side projects, or box sets. Also, there will be no track-by-track or in-depth analysis of each album. Please keep this in mind, and I can't stress this enough. This is just my own personal ranking, and it's just my own opinion. If you disagree or want to share your ranking list, please leave a comment. I would love to get your thoughts and opinions. So, without further ado, let's start out with number 13.
Should it be impossible that a man might supervise the construction of light? Construction of light. Days night, beauty lie, what joy, love, empty time, sun, hurt, trust.
Not a bad album, however, I would say this is one that really doesn't resonate with me. The band at this point had whittled down from the double trio lineup to a four-piece, which would record this and their next album. This album just doesn't pack the punch that usual Crimson albums have. This was the first lineup where Robert Fripp was the sole Englishman of the group.
I swear at the swarming herds, I sweat the foul rain, I roll the moving scenery.
This is my least favorite of the three 80s albums they made. After their fantastic 80s comeback album Discipline, this just kind of is in the same vein, however not as strong in my opinion. Still a decent album and worth checking out nonetheless. This is the first release in King Crimson's discography to feature the same lineup as the previous studio album. This album, I feel, is stronger than their previous album. Even though the 80s Crimson is not my favorite period, this is a very good album. The title track is one of my favorites of theirs, although I do prefer the later live versions of it. After this album, Crimson would go dormant for a few years. The title of this album is based on the idea of perfect opposites, or his truth, her truth, and an objective truth. The idea of three sides to every story. This was a very important album for them. After disbanding Crimson in 1974, Robert Fripp put together a new lineup in 1981. Only Fripp and drummer Bill Bruford remained from the previous incarnation. This album sounds drastically different from their prior albums. It's more streamlined, however it is very progressive, thanks in part to new singer and guitarist Adrian Belew. He would front them for the rest of their studio albums. This album kicked off 3 albums with this lineup in the 80s, with this one being my favorite. The track, Thala Hunjinjit, is an anagram for Heat in the Jungle. The first and only studio album recorded with the double trio lineup, this was reminiscent in a way to their 70s sound. This album has a fantastic mix of serene ballads, experimental, and heavy tracks. It always amazes me how this band actually progresses and pushes their sound into new areas and tries new things. Highly recommended. With the band consisting of 2 guitarists, 2 bassists, and 2 drummers, the opening track begins with all 6 musicians in the center of the audio mix. As the album progresses, they are split into 2 trios, with 1 guitarist, bassist, and drummer heard in the left channel, and the other guitarist, bassist, and drummer heard coming from the right channel. As of recording this video, this is their most recent studio album. I feel this is such a stronger album compared to their prior album, The ConstruKtion of Light, recorded with the same lineup. This has more of a heavy and aggressive vibe, which really works well and packs a punch. I love that a band this late in their career can come out with such a heavy, modern-sounding album. They are never a band to rest on their laurels, which I respect. The album's second track, Level 5, acts as the 5th and final entry in the Larks Tongue and Aspic suite.
Gloves race round the ring, stallion stampeded, pandemonium seesaw. I ran for the door, ringmaster shout, all the fun of the circus.
This was the second Crimson album to be recorded with a transitional lineup. That being said, they still managed to create a terrific album. Their sound on this record progressed from their first 2 albums and seamlessly blends rock, jazz, and classical in a way that only Crimson can. Yes's John Anderson provides vocals on the epic title track. I feel like this is one of their forgotten albums and doesn't get the love it deserves. I was so happy that a couple of tracks were played live when I saw Crimson perform a couple of years ago. To me, that was one of the many highlights of that show. This is more of a slow burn and reveals its greatness with repeated listens. Highly worth checking out again if you haven't heard it in a while. This was the last album to feature lyrics from founding member Peter Sinfield.
Lost all around our Mother Earth, waits balanced on the scales.
Some say this album is like a carbon copy of their groundbreaking debut album. I think it deserves more credit than that. It's amazing this is such a solid album considering the instability of the band during this time. By the time the album was finished, only Robert Fripp was left as a member. It does have the same feel to some extent as their prior debut album, which to me isn't necessarily a bad thing. At one point, the band considered hiring the then unknown Elton John to be the album's singer, but decided against it. Greg Lake agreed to provide most of the vocals, however, he was already out the door about to form ELP.
Smell of paint, a flask of wine, and turn those faces all to me. The blunderbuss and halberd shaft of Dutch respectability that make their entrance to one by one defenders of that way of life. Red brick home, the bourgeoisie, and guitar lessons for the wife.
An amazing album from my favorite lineup of the band. I didn't realize until years later that a lot of the material here was actually recorded live but edited and blended with studio material. It contains very strong compositions, which is amazing since some of these great tracks were actually improvised on stage. Now that's talent. The THRAK trio was notable for being a quartet piece with only 3 active players. John Wetton on bass guitar, David Cross on viola, and Robert Fripp on mellotron. Bill Bruford spent the entire piece with his drumsticks crossed over his chest, waiting for the right moment to join in, but eventually realized that the improvised piece was progressing better without him. His decision not to add any percussion was seen by the rest of the band as a crucial choice, and he received co-writing credit for the piece. This album kicked off my favorite lineup of the band because of the inclusion of John Wetton on vocals and bass and Bill Bruford on drums. Their sound is more experimental than prior albums, however works extremely well. This is Crimson at another high point in their career after their prior transitional period. Fripp assembled one of his best bands for this and their next 2 albums. All prog rock fans should own this album. This was the first album Bill Bruford played drums on after leaving Yes to join King Crimson. This is and will always be one of my favorite Crimson albums, and I would say the one I listen to the most. This was the first album I heard from them and was completely and utterly blown away. Starless is my all-time favorite Crimson track. Sadly, this would be their last album prior to disbanding for 7 years. It's heavy, even for Crimson standards, but very melodic at the same time. This album contains all the great elements of this amazing band in one splendid album. The track Providence was a free improvisation recorded at their June 30th, 1974 concert at the Palace Theater in Providence, Rhode Island. I would defend the argument that this was the first full prog rock album. Prior to this, there were hints of prog here and there from other artists such as the Beatles, Frank Zappa, Pink Floyd, the Moody Blues, and Procol Harum, to name just a few. However, this album totally encompasses what would become progressive rock and had the strongest influence in my opinion. This must have been something to hear for the first time back in 1969. This album can be beautiful and downright scary at times, and everything in between. It has rightfully stood the test of time and is a landmark album that deserves all the accolades it gets. Barry Godber, a computer programmer, painted the design for the album cover. Sadly, he died in February of 1970 from a heart attack shortly after the album's release. It was his only album cover. The original painting is now owned by Robert Fripp. Thank you very much for watching.